Hi, this is Dr. Rickert. Today I'm going to talk about classical conditioning, which is also known as Pavlovian conditioning, after Ivan Pavlov, this guy right here, the Russian physiologist who first discovered it. This is Pavlov's setup. He was not a psychologist. He was interested in studying digestion in dogs. So he would have a dog in this apparatus. He would put food in the bowl here, and there was a little cannula that went into the dog's mouth that would collect the saliva. And Pavlov would then measure the amount of saliva, and he would also measure the enzymes in it that help with the digestion. And one day he discovered something interesting. He discovered that the dog would start to salivate before he even put the food in the bowl. In fact, sometimes the dog would start to salivate as soon as Pavlov walked into the room. And he realized this is something very interesting, so he decided to study it. And that's when he discovered classical conditioning. He won the Nobel Prize. He didn't actually win the Nobel Prize for this, though. He won the Nobel Prize for the work he did prior to this on digestion. But then when he discovered this phenomenon, which he called a psychic reflex, he decided to study it. And this kind of explains what Pavlov discovered. At time one, you have an unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response. Unconditioned means it's not learned. Classical conditioning always occurs on a reflex, which is a behavior that is not learned. So when you present a certain stimulus, the animal automatically has a certain response, which is the unconditioned response. So in the case of Pavlov's study, the unconditioned stimulus was the food in the dog's mouth. The unconditioned response is that the dog will salivate. The dog does not learn that. If you put food in a dog's mouth, it will automatically salivate. It's unlearned and involuntary. So it's called unconditioned because it's not learned. At time one, if the dog hears a tone, it won't do anything, or it might prick up its ears, but it will not salivate. Because the tone does not naturally cause the dog to salivate. But then on several trials, Pavlov played the tone just before he presented the food in the mouth. We say he paired the tone with the food. That means he played the tone, and then 1 second later he would put the food in the dog's mouth. And after doing that on several trials, it turns out that when the dog heard the tone, it would salivate. That's called the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response because it only occurs after conditioning. It only occurs after the dog has learned something. And it only occurs because the tone was paired with the food in the mouth. So in classical conditioning, you always start out with an unconditioned stimulus, which automatically leads to the unconditioned response. Then you have some type of a conditioned stimulus. It can be many different things. In most of these examples, I'm going to talk about a tone, but it can be other things too. But you have some type of stimulus that originally has no effect on the animal, but then after it has been paired with the unconditioned stimulus on several trials, it starts to have an effect. So in this case, the conditioned stimulus was the tone paired with the unconditioned stimulus of food. And in both cases, the response, both the unconditioned and the conditioned response, is to salivate. Sometimes the conditioned response might be different from the unconditioned response, but in many cases, including this one, they're the same. This is a classic learning curve. This is the strength of the conditioned response, that is the salivating when it hears the tone. And this is the number of trials in which the tone has been paired with the food. And you see at first it doesn't salivate much when it hears the tone. But over time, as the tone has been paired with the food more and more, it starts to salivate more and more. And eventually it levels off. There's some maximum amount of saliva a dog can produce, and it will level off there. So now I'm just going to go over a few other paradigms and describe the situation. And I think it would be best if you pause the video and try to figure out what is the unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response, and the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response. Because just by getting practice, you will learn better. You'll learn more than if you just look at my answers. I will give you the answer, but I'd like you to try to figure it out on your own first. Okay. Eye blink conditioning is another classically conditioned response that we study a lot. They study a lot in rats, or not rats, rabbits. You can also study it in humans just as well. In eye blink conditioning, they put a puff of air on the rabbit's eye, and that makes it blink. And on several trials, they will pair a stimulus such as a tone with the puff of air. That is, the tone sounds first, and then the puff of air comes immediately after it. And after a few trials, the rabbit will blink as soon as it hears the tone. So I'd like you to pause the video now and ask yourself, what is the unconditioned stimulus, what is the unconditioned response, and what is the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response? In this case, the unconditioned stimulus is the puff of air. And the unconditioned response is the eye blink. Again, that's a reflex. It's not learned, it's unconditioned. If you put a puff of air on a rabbit's eye, or on a human's eye for that matter, it will blink. That naturally happens. The conditioned stimulus is the tone, which originally does not make the rabbit blink, but after the tone has been paired with the air puff several times, the tone will make the rabbit blink, which is the conditioned response. Here's another interesting paradigm. It's called the galvanic skin response, sometimes also referred to as the skin conductance response. This is measured in humans. The galvanic skin response is when the conductivity of the skin is altered by emotions. It's measured by putting electrodes on the fingers here. It's actually part of a lie detector test. So when a human has an emotional response, when they perceive an emotional stimulus, they will sweat a little bit. And that increases the electrical conductivity of their skin. So you can put these electrodes on the fingers and present an emotional stimulus and see this electrical reaction in the fingers. Okay. When they use it for classical conditioning, one of the things they do is they will give the person a little shock, not a bad shock, just a little shock. And when somebody gets shocked, they will have this galvanic skin response. And on several trials, they will pair a stimulus, let's say it's a tone, with the shock. So first there's the tone, then there's the shock. They do that on several trials, and eventually what you will see is that the person will have the galvanic skin response when they hear the tone, even before they get the shock. Okay. So I'd like you to pause the video again and ask yourself, what is the unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response, and what is the conditioned stimulus and conditioned response? In this case, the unconditioned stimulus is the shock, and the unconditioned response is the galvanic skin response. That's something that occurs naturally. The fact that it's unconditioned means that it's not learned. If somebody gets shocked, they will have this response in their fingers. The conditioned stimulus is any stimulus that's been paired with the shock, such as a tone. And again, the conditioned response is the galvanic skin response. They're called conditioned because the tone originally would not cause a galvanic skin response. It only does so because it has been paired with the shock. And finally, another paradigm that they study a lot in the lab, also this occurs in humans, and you may have experienced it yourself, called learned taste aversion. And this is what happens when you eat something that makes you sick, and as a result, you no longer like to eat it. So let's say you like pizza. Normally you like pizza, but one day you eat some pizza and you get really sick a little while later, and thereafter you don't like pizza anymore. So in this case, it's a little more complicated, but what is the unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response, and what is the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response? In this case, it's a little tricky. You might want to say that the unconditioned stimulus is the pizza. Really, it's whatever was in the pizza that made you sick. You probably don't even know what the unconditioned stimulus is. But the unconditioned stimulus, I put E. coli here, it's whatever made you sick. It really wasn't the pizza that made you sick. It was something in the pizza. But something made you sick. The unconditioned response was that you get sick. And again, that's something that's not learned. If you eat E. coli, you're going to get sick. That has nothing to do with learning. The conditioned stimulus would be the taste, smell, or sometimes even the thought of the food. So the taste or the smell of the food is a conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response is feeling sick or having an aversion to that food. Usually you wouldn't actually get sick if you smelled the pizza, but you might feel kind of sick and you would not want to eat it. So that's another form of classical conditioning. So just to wrap up, in classical conditioning, you have the unconditioned stimuli and the unconditioned responses, which are the things that that naturally have an effect on the animal. The stimulus naturally leads to the response. Those are unconditioned. And then the conditioned stimulus comes to cause the conditioned response only because it has been paired with the unconditioned stimulus. It's a result of learning. And that's it.